I can't really tell you my name. Not if I plan on telling you the story. I mean, the laws today, especially those established by HIPAA, would have me persecuted for it. I know there are hundreds of people who won't believe me, and one major broadcasting company who will try to keep this under wraps. But I can't keep this quiet anymore. I can't bear the thought of taking this to my grave. Now, don't get me wrong, I've seen a lot of twisted things in my long career. I was working as a doctor in the psyche ward of the largest children's hospital in the state. You know, it tests your boundaries if you work with children like that. I've seen so many mentally disturbed children. They range from the age of 5 to 17. Some, moved me, some humiliated me, and some have just downright scared me. But I managed to endure. I managed to endure through them all. Through the young man who thought they were actually monsters living under his bed and closet, and he talked to them, and he talked about killing his aunt's cat the next time he went over because it tasted him for having its tail pulled. I'm sorry for laughing, it's just... his stories were so amusing at the time. Oh, and there was the little 13-year-old girl who he agitated. She was completely sane, but she was convinced that she was actually bipolar, even though she wasn't. Oh, trust me, I've seen plenty. I'm on the first-name basis with most of the police and the manager of the nearby insane asylums. I know all the therapists and the psychologists within the tri-state area, so I certainly know what I'm talking about. But nothing could have really prepared me for that little girl who came into my ward. See, her name was one that, well, if you lived in the 90s, you would definitely recognise it. And she was 3 years old when she first came into my ward. It was really an unusual age for them to come to us. Normally, when they're at that age, the children are still developing the behaviours. Physicians are hesitant to diagnose anything that might be related to their mental development until they're at least 5 or 6. So, once I got my hands on her medical chart, I understood what actually brought her here. It made sense after that. I can't really give her name. I mean, it would be wrong of me, but her medical chart, it was stuff of nightmares. It began from day one, detailing the gradual wearing off of heroin or some sort of powerful drug. Apparently her mother was a routine drug addict, while her father could do nothing but watch her decay. It was all right. I mean, every time the poor soul brought her in, he seemed horribly distracted. Her stepmother was, for all intents and purposes, what I would call a heartless bitch. She seemed more like a gold digger to me. But she was professional, and I really couldn't, state my opinions out loud. I had to be polite and make sure she had her say as the legal mother, for the time being anyways. She was always dressed quite sharply, and she always had a phone, but she never really seemed to acknowledge her stepdaughter. We'll just call my patient Princess. See, at first glance, it was a run-of-the-mill 3-year-old. She had short blonde hair, and it was often in a pigtail. Her outfit was usually quite colourful, and it was, if I remember, it was a purple dress and an orange shirt. Yes, with blue and green stockings, that's right, green stockings. Every time they came to my office, she... It's hard to describe. She looked like to be a cross between a Barbie doll and the wife of Frankenstein's monster. That was the doll, anyway. She looked similar to it, but not as bad. She'd have this weird-looking doll always clutched in her hands. She would treat it as a best friend, often consulting, if anyone else couldn't sway a judgment, she'd talk to that doll. And sometimes the doll was able to display her judgment. It did. Although it didn't really move, it didn't really talk, there wasn't really anything else that was wrong with it. It was relatively normal. It was just a bit haggard and ugly. There were times, though, when Princess would get extremely upset and come to shouting matches with a doll. 5 minutes later, the sound of she and the doll laughing would be all you could hear. Now, I know it's silly to think that an imaginary friend at that age It's harmless, isn't it? But that relationship back then, if I remember, it didn't feel right. See, that doll wasn't the only thing that seemed to be a little bit weird about Princess. There were times in which Princess would go on walks for hours and she talked to these children called the babies. They were children that she often played with, and she played with them whenever she went over to her aunt's and uncle's house. The adults were in the kitchen or outside or on a grown-up outing, and she'd just stay with the children, these imaginary friends she had. She even had names for them. Tommy, Chucky, Phil and Lil. It did sound innocent enough at the time, and she would tell me about them. How Chucky was a fraidy cat, and Phil and Lil were twins, and Tommy was her little cousin. He was the son of her father's brother, so naturally I didn't think anything of it. After all, the way she described them, I actually thought they were real, and they'd played together several times before. So, after I'd seen her for about a week, I had a follow-up meeting with her parents in one of the rooms. We told Princess to go out and stay in one of the playrooms. It was monitored by a few nurses and had a couple of cameras around, so nothing could happen to the girl while we were talking. So I sat them both down and I tried to speak to them, but none of them seemed to be genuinely interested in their daughter's progress. No, I'm wrong, I'm sorry. Her father seemed to be interested. It was just her mother who was constantly on her phone. She didn't even seem to look at me. She was more interested in what was going on in the outside world, what was going on in her job. It was absolutely ridiculous. In the end, I had to politely suggest that she step outside to finish the phone call. She didn't even offer to stay. It was sad, very sad. So she left the room and I focused on her father instead. I told her father everything that Princess had said to me and what her reactions were with her doll and her little play dates with the babies. And he was nodding, and he was stoic enough for the first few stories about the doll and anecdotes all about these dolls. It was a relatively normal conversation. But then I got to the 4 babies. There was a definite change in his pallor, and it set in almost instantly, as soon as I brought up the topic, in fact. So I stopped. I asked if he needed some water or fresh air or anything at all. I asked him what was wrong as well, of course I did. And he managed to tell me that none of those children, Tommy, Chucky, Phil, or Lil, were actually alive. I was so confused, but he began to elaborate. He said, "You see, my brother and I were friends with 2 other families whom we'd met through different neighbourhood meetings and parent prep classes, and Princess used to know Chucky when she was around a year old, but she didn't really understand that Chucky and his mother passed away due to an illness of some sort. Naturally, he was very vague on the details. But when I asked about the other 3, Tommy, Phil, and Lil, he explained about them as well. Phil and Lil. We have another friend who was pregnant, and Princess was so excited. She always wanted to know whether it was going to be a boy or a girl, but the mother didn't know. She always said she was going to keep it a surprise, and the surprise was she ended up having a spontaneous abortion. Thus, no one really ever knew, since no one wanted to ask her if it was a girl or a boy. I guess that those 2 came about because she didn't really know which was which, and we certainly told her not to ask about it. It was inappropriate. I nodded, and he even told me that he'd been down this road before, and that he had a few of his own theories established. I asked him about Tommy, and this look of pain. It was just for an instant, but it flashed across his face, and it made me feel so horrible. He said Tommy was my brother's first child. He grew very distant at this point, and I sort of swallowed about what he said. It was just the word was. He She was just so excited to have a little cousin, he mumbled. There was a complication and, well, he was a stillborn. He wasn't even talking normally by now. He was whispering. And for some reason the news made my blood run cold. I didn't know why, but something just didn't feel right about this. He continued. We took her to the funeral and she was so confused. She didn't know what we meant when we said that he was in a better place. He fell silent and we sat there in an awkward silence. Obviously, Princess's mother was still on the phone outside. She was so loud, I bet even her daughter could hear her. I sighed and I took a card out from my desk, writing my personal number on the back and handing it to him. I told him that he could phone me whenever he needed to talk. But I never heard from him again. The next week it went by as normal. Princess would talk about the latest thing that the babies and she had done, and the weird thing was, they would always do what she had said each and every time. Well, almost every time. There was a friend of hers, Susie, who not only was real, it was confirmed by her father, but seemed to help stem Princess's realities in a way. I was encouraged by that, at least, and I tried to focus more on Susie when Princess would come for visits. She kept insisting now that we would talk about the babies. It'd be nothing else, just that. Susie was never an imperative, and it worried me that she was focusing on these fantasies more than the actual reality. For the next month, or the next few months, I can't really tell anymore, nothing seemed to really change. She wasn't any better, but she didn't seem to get any worse either. It was a sort of neutral situation. But then she suddenly stopped coming altogether, and that concerned me greatly. For almost a week, any call I placed to her home would just be ignored, or it would never go through. I was very concerned for her and her father, especially since I'd learned a couple of weeks before that her father had a breakdown and he'd cut himself accidentally, with a knife, while, slicing vegetables for dinner, and only Princess saw that. I highly doubt that's what happened, but I had little choice but to go along with it. After all, my patience with my children, and I couldn't sit them down properly with her father. No, I just couldn't. I had to do it on my own. I had to find out what was happening on my own. After that initial week of no contact, days passed before I finally received a phone call from Princess's stepmother. It was odd. It was the first ever time I'd heard affection coming from her. It sounded like she had been crying, and I asked her what was wrong. What I meant was, why are you crying? What I got, though, was not what I was expecting. It was even more than what I was expecting. Apparently, a year after Tommy was delivered as a stillborn, Princess's uncle and aunt had tried again for a child and had succeeded. Princess was delighted, naturally, at having a new cousin, and so when we were allowed, we all went over for a welcome visit. It was to welcome the new member of the family. Her stepmother told me this, and knowing all that Princess had told me, though, I had a gut feeling that something had gone incredibly wrong. I didn't have to hang on too much longer. In a moment, a somewhat malicious voice came on the phone. It was Princess's stepmother still, but she didn't exactly sound benevolent anymore. Her stepmother told me that the adults had stepped out of the living room to see the baby bed, and they had left the grandfather watching Princess and the new baby. The grandfather allegedly had spent the entire night out and was falling asleep in his chair, and Princess was playing with the baby. There was a thunk heard, followed by a loud wail of pain and angry scream. The adults had all rushed into the room at once and saw Grandpa desperately trying to tear an enraged and rabid-looking Princess off the bleating and screaming newborn. She explained to me that Princess was screaming and shouting at the infant, and Grandpa in unison snapping out, "Why? Why? Why won't you listen to me?" I was also told that Princess had used both her fist and the doll that she carried around with her to hit the infant upside her head. his head. I'm sorry, it's hard to even think that a child could do that. Her uncle was the first one who managed to wrestle them apart, petting Princess before letting her go and scooping his son up before running to the hospital. I could barely hear myself when I asked what the child's outcome was. He survived, but there's no chance he'll have normal cognitive function. My heart sank. And how is she taking all of it? Princess, how is she taking it? Her stepmother sighed. She's distraught and her father is a wreck, and I simply don't have the time for all this childish nonsense. She sounded as if she'd rolled her eyes, and I had to bite my tongue. It had hard enough to taste the blood in order to keep from straying from my professional boundaries. I was hoping with one more session with you might work. I really should have said no. 2 days later, a sombre-looking child was delivered to my office door, her mother paying little attention to her. Her phone was still plastered against her ear. Princess was clinging to her doll, her knuckles almost white as she trembled from head to foot. At first glance, I thought I saw the remnants of blood mixed in with the doll's wild and ruined hair. I must have imagined it. Rather, I can guess my subconscious was the only thing that told me I was seeing things. I closed the door and I sat with Princess, looking at her as she trembled terribly. We sat there in silence for at least 20 minutes before she opened her mouth. I didn't mean... he just... Princess, I said softly, I heard why you hit him, but I'm afraid I still don't understand why. She spoke, trembling harder now, sounding as if she just didn't want to cry, but she was trying not to. She was about to give, but she was trying so hard. He wouldn't listen to me. She broke down now, sobbing pitifully. I hit the others before, but nothing bad happened to them. She practically screamed this. I wish I could imitate how it sounded, but I don't think I could capture such terror and rage from this child. This little girl, this little child, though, she couldn't have been more than just 4 had she been addicted to drugs, manipulated, lied to, and exposed to death, self-harm, and now attempted murder. And by all those closest to her, she seemed so lost, so forlorn. It broke my heart. I asked her why she hadn't been to my office for the past few weeks, and she had said that she and her family, the baby cousin included, had taken a trip to France with their friend, where apparently he met a young woman and who had a mother who was called the Chinese whore. I didn't want to ask how she knew this language, but I can assume where she heard it from. Her young daughter was a year younger than the princess. I didn't bother to ask if it was true. She didn't exhibit her usual characteristics as she was talking about the babies. I'm not going to do it again. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. She sobbed, clutching the doll as if it was the last thing on earth, holding her already fraying sanity to the ground. To hear a child crying like that without being able to do anything makes you feel absolutely horrible. To hear a psychotic child screaming for help with real tears was something that absolutely crushed me. I didn't touch her, didn't move to her, even though I probably should have. After the hour was up, her stepmother came in and said that she had an appointment to keep. I nodded and left the princess and wrote the old woman a referral to one of the best child psychologists in the state. He may run a higher fee than the others, but he's the best at diagnosing and treating. My child is not a goddamn psychopath. The stepmother shouted at me, and I had to step back. This was the first time I'd ever heard her reference her as a child. I glanced back at Princess, who was standing in the doorway. Tears and snot were streaming down her face. She coughed and sobbed, sounding as if she was choking on her own tears. Her stepmother walked over and grabbed her by the arm and yanked her out, saying, "Come on, you precious princess," dragging her out of my office, and then she slammed the door behind her. I never saw those two again. About 10 or 11 years later, I was still in the practice, but I could never get that little girl off my mind. It was one afternoon, and things were quiet when I saw two young women walk into my office. They'd obviously been crying, and I walked out into the reception area and asked what was wrong, getting a better look at them. They both looked about 13 or 14. One of them was an African American with short black hair, and it was in a ponytail. The other was Asian, assumingly Chinese, with short spiky hair. Each one was walking in each other's arms. When they looked into my eyes, they asked me if I was the one who talked to the little girl several years ago. They told me Prince's name, and I nodded, inviting them into an empty office and closing the door behind me. It was soundproof, so there was no fear of someone hearing us. "She always talked about you," the African American had said. She then proceeded to tell me that my old patient, that little girl, she died. She died of an overdose of LSD, I believe. I was horrified when she told me that, and I looked at her critically. She went on to expand that she'd been doing perfectly fine until one day when she finally snapped. They couldn't place what made her go insane, but they thought it was a constant view of her cousin working at the lower level of learning than everyone else. The guilt had finally crushed her, and she slipped back into the drugs, her old addictions renewed. She had begun to lash out at even the two of them. They had been her closest and only friends, and yet she still did it, shouting things at them like, "Why do I even deserve to be here at all? What's the meaning of life? Where was everyone when I needed you? I shouldn't have ignored everything. Why was I even brought into this world? I don't deserve to live, and I wish I could just rewind it all." Hearing those trigger phrases made me bristle. Obviously her parents had neglected to take her to the psychologist I referred her to. I swallowed and asked about the circumstances surrounding her death. She lost it completely. The Asian took over, holding her trembling friend in her arms. She took several doses of a variety of drugs, saying that she was going to rewind it all. She couldn't do it at home, so she'd done it at school. No one noticed her, not even the administrations. She just sat in the corner of the cafeteria, rocking back and forth, calling out to Tommy, Chucky, Phil and Lil, and shouting that the world was backwards several times. We tried approaching her, but she wouldn't let us anywhere near her. And when she finally stopped shouting backwards, she started laughing and screaming, "Now my world is perfect." That got the attention of the administration, but it was too late. She choked out the last phrase. The overdose triggered a massive seizure, and she died. She died right in that cafeteria. I appreciate you coming to tell me I managed. "We thought you needed to know," the Asian had said. "Also, we wanted to ask a question. The last thing Princess asked us was if she was a princess or a psychopath. Were you the one who told her that she was?" she asked. "No," I said quietly. "I don't have the authority to diagnose that on my own. The last time I saw her, it was a stepmother that shouted to her where she could hear. She screamed. She said that she wasn't a psychopath, that she was a precious princess." The three of us sat there in my office for what seemed like an eternity, and once they left, I walked to my boss and I gave him a handwritten letter of resignation, and I promptly left. leaving everything behind. Now, about 6 or 7 years after that, as I sit here and write this, I can hear my television behind me, and there's a new cartoon show that a new kids channel has started airing. It centers on 4 babies and their parents, all friends who are often away from their children, and they let them play. This seems pretty harmless, but at the center of these 4, there's a 3-year-old little girl with blonde hair, and it's often in pigtails. She wears an outfit that it's consisted of colourful garments ranging from purple to an orange shirt and green and blue spiked stockings. And she carries around what sort of looks like a cross between a Barbie and a wife of Frankenstein's monster, a sort of doll that's clutched in her hands. She would treat this as her best friend, often consulting it as if its input would be able to sway her judgment, which it seemed to do. Her father is wealthy, her mother is always busy, and they often call her Princess. The babies, Tommy, Chucky, Phil and Lil, they usually follow her around and usually go after what she has to say, even though it's relatively comical. And as the credits roll, I see the name of one of the producers of this idea, and I catch a name, a first name. Susie. I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but it just seems too wild to be true. All I can say for certain is this: the little girl in the cartoon has the exact same first name and last name of my 3-year-old patient, who wanted nothing more than to rewind the world and create a utopia for herself.